Imagine stepping into the torchlit, embalming hall of ancient Egypt, the air thick with incense and the silence broken only by the scrape of bronze blades. On the slab before you lies the queen herself, but the orders you've been given shatter every sacred rule you've ever known. This is not just a mummification, it is a violation of body and soul, commanded in the name of the gods. What you're about to learn is not the Egypt from tourist brochures. Beneath the golden glory lay disturbing sexual customs, so extreme, so ritualized, that for centuries historians locked the truth away in vaults. Today, we're opening those vaults, and what's inside will make you question everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. When most people think of ancient Egypt, their minds go straight to shimmering treasures, towering pyramids, and the serene, enigmatic faces of pharaohs carved in stone. Schoolbooks and documentaries present a civilization of order, beauty, and divine kingship, where the gods walked beside men and the river Nile carried life into the desert. But beneath that polished image existed a reality that was far more complicated and infinitely more unsettling. For 3,000 years, Egypt thrived on a belief system that fused sexuality and divinity so completely that no clear boundary existed between worship, political authority, and intimate life. To the ancient Egyptians, sex was not simply a private act between two people. It was cosmic power, a force that could bless or curse the land, summon floods or droughts, heal the sick or spread pestilence. The more you understand this worldview, the more you realize that it created customs so disturbing that later generations, especially the Victorians who unearthed their remains, would go to extraordinary lengths to hide them from the public eye. These were not isolated incidents or the secret perversions of a few individuals. They were systemic, embedded into the very structure of society, from the golden throne room to the humblest village hut. In the ideology of ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a king. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and upon his death he became Osiris, lord of the underworld. This dual identity meant that the ruler's sexual vitality was thought to be directly linked to the health of the kingdom itself. If the pharaoh could perform the sacred rites of intimacy with potency and precision, the Nile would rise, crops would flourish, and the enemies of Egypt would be vanquished. Failure in this divine duty was more than personal embarrassment. It was a cosmic disaster that could invite famine, plague, or invasion. As a result, the royal household lived under an immense and relentless pressure to prove sexual capability before the gods and the people. This pressure did not just weigh on the pharaoh himself, it extended to his wives, concubines, children, and even certain members of the priesthood. Every intimate act could become a public, ceremonial event charged with religious symbolism and political consequence. The texts and images left behind, though heavily censored by modern eyes, offer tantalizing and disturbing glimpses into these practices. In temple reliefs not shown to tourists, we find depictions of ritual intercourse between the ruler and a high priestess representing the goddess Hathor or Isis. Such ceremonies were believed to renew the divine order of the universe. But they did not always stop at symbolic representation. Some rituals involved actual sexual acts performed in front of carefully chosen witnesses, usually members of the elite priestly class, who would later attest to the pharaoh's potency in official records. In certain festivals, these acts took place in specially built temple chambers whose walls were carved with scenes so explicit that when 19th century archaeologists uncovered them, they either destroyed the carvings or sealed the rooms entirely. The justification for these ceremonies was couched in religious terms, but the effect was the normalization, even glorification, of sexual spectacle as a tool of governance. It was within this environment that more private, yet no less disturbing, customs took shape. The royal tombs and burial goods reveal an obsession with preserving sexual function into the afterlife. Amulets shaped like genitals were placed within the wrappings of mummies, and papyrus spells described how to ensure the deceased could perform intimately in the next world. For certain high-status individuals, embalmers were instructed to modify the body in ways meant to perfect its sexual form. These modifications could include enhancement or alteration of the genitals, as well as the application of aromatic resins believed to preserve virility. While some of these alterations were done after death, the written records suggest that similar procedures were sometimes performed on the living, a practice that blurs the line between ritual devotion and bodily violation. The link between sexuality and religious duty also had a profound, and often tragic, impact on children born into elite households. Inscriptions and instructional papyri indicate that some children were dedicated to temple service from a young age, not merely as singers, dancers, or scribes, but as participants in sacred rites involving the embodiment of divine union. To the Egyptian religious mind, these children were not victims. They were vessels of the gods, chosen for their purity and trained to perform roles that would supposedly maintain cosmic balance. Yet from a modern perspective, this training, involving physical conditioning, ritualized intimacy, and psychological conditioning, would be recognized as a form of systemic abuse. The child's identity, body, and future were subsumed into the machinery of state religion, with no possibility of refusal. The archaeological record is filled with absences, gaps where one suspects the most revealing evidence was deliberately removed. Victorian excavators, confronted with explicit papyri or artifacts that depicted sexual customs outside the bounds of their moral comfort, often destroyed what they found. Some of these items were hidden away in private collections of major museums, accessible only to select scholars under strict confidentiality agreements. As a result, our view of Egyptian sexuality has been shaped as much by what was concealed as by what was preserved. The few pieces that have surfaced tell a consistent story, that in ancient Egypt, sexual customs were not simply tolerated or accepted, they were elevated to the highest level of sacred duty, and in doing so, they crossed boundaries that modern sensibilities cannot ignore. To fully grasp the scope of these customs, one must imagine living in a world where the intimate and the divine were one and the same, where refusing to participate in a sexual rite could be seen as an act of treason against the gods, and where your body, from birth to death, was never entirely your own. It was a world where power was performed through the most personal of acts, and where those acts were witnessed, recorded, and judged by the standards of divine necessity. In such a society, the most private aspects of life became tools of political control and religious legitimacy, creating a system that perpetuated itself for centuries, passing trauma and tradition from one generation to the next. And as we will see in the following sections, the deeper we look into these customs, the more we uncover rituals so extreme, so bound to the Egyptian understanding of cosmic order, that even today their full implications remain difficult to confront. By the time Egypt's civilization had reached the height of its power, the relationship between sexual expression and religious authority had evolved into a vast, tightly controlled system that touched every level of society. This was not a culture where such acts were confined to the privacy of homes or the discretion of lovers. Instead, sexuality functioned as a visible, structured performance, woven into festivals, rites, and the political calendar, with an intensity that astonished even contemporary visitors from other lands. Temple inscriptions from Karnak, Luxor, and Edfu, most of them concealed from the public in restricted museum vaults, reveal elaborate ceremonies in which the union of gods and goddesses was physically enacted by human representatives, chosen from among the highest ranks of the nobility. These representatives were often selected not simply for their devotion or piety, but for their physical beauty, fertility, and, in some cases, their ability to endure hours of ceremonial display without faltering. This endurance was not symbolic. Many rituals required extended intimate acts in front of carefully positioned witnesses, often other priests or members of the royal family, who would later record their observations as testimony that the divine will had been satisfied. The belief underlying such acts was deceptively simple, yet infinitely far-reaching. Sexual energy was divine energy, and to channel it properly was to maintain the balance of the cosmos. In the Egyptian worldview, every orgasm was a small reenactment of the original act of creation, when the god Atum brought the world into being through his own seed. To experience pleasure in a sacred context was, therefore, not indulgence, but service to the gods. And yet, because human beings were imperfect vessels, these acts were wrapped in complex layers of training, ritual purification, and symbolic framing to ensure they were worthy offerings. Participants underwent days of fasting, anointing, and recitation of specific hymns before engaging in any physical act, reinforcing the idea that their bodies were merely instruments for the divine rather than their own. This mindset was especially dangerous for those born into the system, particularly the children of the elite, because it erased any concept of personal autonomy. To refuse was unthinkable, not only because of social pressure, but because it was believed that the very stability of Egypt's universe was at stake. It is here that the archaeological silences become most telling. In the early 20th century, when radiographic imaging first allowed researchers to study mummified remains without fully unwrapping them, a disturbing pattern emerged. Several royal and high-ranking mummies displayed deliberate alterations to the genitals, often performed with surgical precision. These were not random mutilations caused by decay or accident, but purposeful modifications executed shortly after death, consistent with known embalming practices. Some mummies appeared to have been enhanced, their genital areas packed with resins or artificial structures meant to preserve an idealized form in the afterlife. Others were missing those organs entirely. The reasons, according to certain religious texts, were tied to preparing the deceased for a specific role in the next world, such as eternal service to a deity or readiness for union with a divine partner. What is more troubling is that some skeletal remains show signs of similar procedures performed on the living, as indicated by bone healing and tissue trauma consistent with pre-mortem operations. The implications of this evidence are profound, and they push us to consider that the most disturbing customs of ancient Egypt may have been even more invasive than the ceremonies recorded in temple art. If sexual modification could be justified as an act of religious preparation, then it could also be imposed on anyone deemed necessary for divine purposes, regardless of their personal will. The power this gave to the priesthood and ruling elite was immense. They could claim the authority to dictate not only how individuals behaved in life, but also how their bodies would be treated in death, ensuring that loyalty to the system extended beyond the grave. The physical evidence of these practices is rare precisely because of the deliberate suppression that followed. Victorian Egyptologists, horrified by what they found, frequently destroyed or concealed such remains rather than publish their details. Museums built entire special collections, locked away from the public, sometimes described only in vague catalogue entries, such as miscellaneous organic matter or non-exhibitable specimen. And yet, even with so much evidence hidden, enough fragments survive to reveal the true scope of the system. Ancient papyri recovered from temple archives describe the duties of so-called divine companions, individuals, often very young, chosen to accompany the pharaoh or high priest in both life and death. These companions were instructed in complex techniques for prolonging and controlling physical pleasure, methods that involved breathing patterns, ritual chants, and physical postures associated with specific deities. The training was not optional. It was a form of initiation, and those who failed to meet the exacting standards could face expulsion from temple service, exile, or worse. Such texts make clear that these roles were not seen as shameful within Egyptian culture. Rather, they were considered the highest calling, a sacrifice made for the good of all Egypt. But from a modern vantage point, the lack of choice, the age of the participants, and the physical demands placed upon them can only be understood as systemic exploitation, masked in the language of piety. For the Egyptians themselves, the effectiveness of these customs was measured not in individual satisfaction, but in cosmic signs, a plentiful harvest, the timely flooding of the Nile, military victory against foreign powers. If these signs failed to appear, the rituals could intensify, becoming longer, more public, and more extreme in the hope of appeasing the gods. Such desperation opened the door to an escalation in both the scale and the severity of the acts performed. The line between sacred duty and brutality blurred until, for many participants, there was no difference at all. The state demanded the body, the priesthood sanctified the demand, and the people accepted it as the price of survival. In this way, the most disturbing sexual customs of ancient Egypt were not aberrations. They were institutionalized, reinforced by the highest authorities, and carried out with the conviction that without them, the world itself might collapse. Among all the rites and customs that blurred the boundaries between the sacred and the intimate in ancient Egypt, none matched the scale and unrestrained chaos of the great festival dedicated to the goddess Hathor in her more primal, intoxicated aspect. This was not a private ceremony performed in the hidden chambers of a temple, nor a solemn rite witnessed only by priests and scribes. It was a public eruption that engulfed entire cities, drawing peasants and nobles alike into a collective frenzy that could last for days on end. Known in later writings as the Festival of Intoxication, it was rooted in one of Egypt's most ancient and potent myths, the story of how the fierce lioness goddess Sekhmet, sent by the sun god Ra to punish humanity, became so bloodthirsty that she nearly annihilated all life. To stop her rampage, the gods brewed vast quantities of beer, tinted with red ochre, making it resemble the blood she craved. Sekhmet drank deeply, believing it to be her enemy's lifeblood, and fell into a stupor that transformed her into the gentler, more nurturing goddess Hathor. It was this transformation, from bloodlust to drunken ecstasy, that the festival sought to reenact every year. But over time, the commemoration took on a life of its own, shedding any restraint that may once have existed and becoming one of the most unrestrained displays of ritualized sexuality the ancient world had ever seen. Preparations for the festival began months in advance. Temples brewed enormous vats of beer, often enhanced with extracts from the blue lotus, a plant known for its psychoactive properties, as well as other substances intended to heighten both physical desire and the vividness of hallucinations. Priests selected participants for key ceremonial roles, and musicians rehearsed the rhythmic chants and hypnotic drumbeats that would accompany the processions. The air in the cities grew thick with anticipation as traders stocked their stalls with perfumes, cosmetics, and amulets meant to attract divine favor during the celebrations. When the appointed day arrived, the streets filled with crowds dressed in their finest linens, bodies painted with intricate designs, and eyes lined with heavy kohl to ward off the glare of the sun and the gaze of evil spirits. But as the first offerings of beer were poured and the music began to swell, the atmosphere shifted from reverence to abandon, and the true nature of the festival revealed itself. From the moment the intoxicants took hold, normal social hierarchies collapsed. Masters and slaves drank from the same jars, danced together in the open, and engaged in intimate acts in full view of the public. Married women slipped away from their households to join strangers in shadowed courtyards, while men competed for the attention of temple dancers whose movements were said to mimic the goddess herself. The festival grounds became a vast stage where every desire could be acted upon without fear of reprisal, for it was believed that during these days of divine possession, all acts were sanctified by Hathor's blessing. Children, who in other societies might have been shielded from such displays, were instead drawn into the current, witnessing or even participating in the rituals as part of their supposed initiation into the mysteries of the goddess. Foreign envoys and traders who happened to be present often wrote of their shock and revulsion, describing scenes in which the entire population seemed to dissolve into a single, writhing organism driven by intoxication and divine fervor. But the festival's excesses were not limited to sexual indulgence. The same frenzied state that emboldened people to seek pleasure also unleashed acts of violence that were likewise justified as offerings to the goddess. Biting, scratching, and other forms of bodily harm were seen as marks of favor from the divine. Some participants bore fresh wounds proudly, as proof that Hathor had touched them through the body of another celebrant. In the most extreme cases, individuals died from internal injuries sustained during the more violent encounters, or were trampled by crowds moving chaotically through the narrow streets. And yet, far from condemning these deaths, the priests interpreted them as a form of sacred sacrifice, the price paid for the renewal of cosmic balance. The mingling of pleasure and pain, of ecstasy and brutality, became the defining feature of the celebration, and those who survived carried both the scars and the memories for the rest of their lives. To the ruling elite, the festival served multiple purposes beyond its religious justification. It acted as a pressure valve for the rigid, hierarchical structure of Egyptian society, allowing the lower classes to experience, if only briefly, the freedom to defy authority, mock their superiors, and indulge desires normally suppressed by custom and law. This temporary collapse of order gave the illusion of liberation, but it was carefully managed to ensure that once the festival ended, the old hierarchies could be reimposed without resistance. The pharaoh himself was often present, either directly participating in the rites or presiding from an elevated platform, reinforcing his role as the embodiment of divine harmony who sanctioned both the chaos and the restoration of order. In this way, the most disturbing sexual customs of the festival were not merely tolerated, but actively orchestrated by the state, their energy harnessed to strengthen political control. Archaeological evidence of these events survives in fragments. Pottery shards still stained with residues of fermented beer, murals hidden beneath later plasterwork that depict processions of nude dancers, and temple chambers outfitted with stone benches whose surfaces bear marks consistent with repeated vigorous use. While Victorian archaeologists often suppressed or destroyed such finds, some items escaped their censorship, ending up in private collections or overlooked storerooms. Modern chemical analysis of residues from festival vessels confirms the presence of psychoactive alkaloids, lending weight to ancient accounts of the hallucinatory visions reported by participants. These discoveries have forced historians to confront the reality that the festival was not a quaint folk tradition distorted by hostile outsiders, but a central, state-endorsed institution that fused intoxication, sexual freedom, and ritual violence into a single, devastating expression of divine worship. In the aftermath of each festival, the return to normal life was often jarring. Families were torn apart by what had transpired in the haze of intoxication, and children conceived during the celebrations sometimes bore the stigma of uncertain parentage, known in whispers as the children of Hathor. Yet despite the personal costs, the festival endured for centuries, a testament to the power of collective ecstasy and the unshakable belief that through these acts, no matter how disturbing they appear to us today, Egypt renewed its bond with the divine. To stand in the heart of such a celebration was to witness the collapse of every barrier between sacred and profane, pleasure and violence, order and chaos, leaving behind a vision of humanity stripped bare before the gods. As centuries passed, and Egypt's position in the ancient world shifted, the disturbing sexual customs that had once been celebrated as vital to cosmic harmony began to face challenges from foreign rulers whose own traditions were deeply at odds with Egypt's sacred sensuality. The arrival of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek rulers who inherited the Egyptian throne after the conquests of Alexander the Great, marked the beginning of a delicate and often volatile negotiation between two worlds. The Greeks admired Egypt's antiquity, its monumental architecture, and its wealth of religious traditions, but they were unsettled, even repelled, by the open fusion of sexuality and divine worship. In their Mediterranean worldview, Certain rites were better left in the realm of metaphor or confined to private initiations, not acted out in public squares or temple courtyards. Yet to govern Egypt effectively, the Ptolemies had to present themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as rightful heirs to the pharaonic legacy, which meant participating in at least some of the rituals that the Egyptian priesthood deemed essential for maintaining Ma'at, the sacred balance of the universe. This created a paradox in which Greek monarchs found themselves compelled to sponsor ceremonies that they personally found scandalous, navigating a political landscape in which refusal could be interpreted as sacrilege, inviting unrest or even rebellion. For some rulers, compromise took the form of quiet modification rather than outright abolition. Cleopatra I, for instance, sought to reduce the scale of the more excessive festivals, shortening their duration and imposing limits on public sexual displays, all while attempting to preserve the core religious symbolism that gave the rites their legitimacy. These reforms were presented as practical adjustments, necessary to maintain order in a cosmopolitan kingdom where Greek settlers, Egyptian natives, and foreign merchants lived side by side. But to the traditional priesthood, any alteration to the sacred cycle risked offending the gods. In their view, if the Nile failed to flood on time or a plague struck the cattle herds, such misfortunes would be read as divine punishment for meddling with rituals that had endured for millennia. Priests wielded this fear as a political weapon, using natural disasters as evidence to pressure the monarchy into restoring the full scope of the ancient customs. The result was a constant tension in which the state was forced to balance the demands of religious conservatism with the political realities of an increasingly interconnected Mediterranean world. When Rome extended its power over Egypt, this tension reached its breaking point. Roman officials, schooled in the language of law and order, viewed Egypt's sexualized festivals and ritual practices not as quaint cultural differences, but as symptoms of moral decay. The idea that public orgies, sexual violence, and ritualized intoxication could be acts of worship was, to the Roman mind, both barbaric and politically dangerous, for such spectacles could rally large crowds outside the control of imperial authority. Augustus Caesar, upon formally annexing Egypt in 30 BCE, wasted little time in initiating a program of religious reform that amounted to a systematic suppression of the old customs. Temples known to host the more explicit rites were closed or rededicated to Roman-friendly deities, and priests unwilling to adapt were removed from office, exiled, or executed. Public festivals were stripped of their most overt sexual elements, replaced with carefully choreographed processions that emphasized piety, loyalty to Rome, and the grandeur of the imperial order. Yet even as the public face of Egyptian religion was transformed, much of the old system retreated into the shadows. Certain priestly families continued to conduct modified versions of the ancient rites in secret, limiting participation to trusted initiates and carrying them out in private courtyards, remote shrines, or hidden chambers deep within temple complexes. These clandestine ceremonies, no longer open to the masses, became even more exclusive and intense, their secrecy adding to their allure. Wealthy patrons, including some members of the Roman elite, fascinated by the esoteric, sometimes paid handsomely for the privilege of witnessing or participating in these forbidden rites. The trafficking of child slaves for temple service, though officially banned, persisted underground, facilitated by corrupt officials willing to look the other way in exchange for bribes. In this subterranean world, the fusion of sexuality and religion became even more dangerous, for it was now practiced without the public accountability, however flawed, that had once existed, making abuses easier to conceal and victims harder to protect. The cultural clash had other unintended consequences. As Egypt adapted to Roman rule, many of its people experienced what could be described as a collective crisis of identity. For generations, their understanding of the universe had been tied to the performance of these sacred customs, no matter how disturbing they might appear to outsiders. The suppression of such rites did not merely remove a set of ceremonies, It dismantled an entire cosmology, leaving a void that neither Roman law nor imported religious practices could easily fill. Some Egyptians mourned the loss as a betrayal of their ancestors, while others, particularly younger generations raised under Roman influence, came to see the old ways as relics of a more primitive age. This divide deepened social fractures, creating a society in which traditionalists and reformists eyed each other with suspicion, each convinced the other was inviting disaster, whether from divine wrath or political instability. Roman administrators, for their part, found that erasing centuries of religiously sanctioned sexual customs was more difficult than they had anticipated. Reports survive of underground cults reviving elements of the old festivals, of hidden artworks depicting the union of gods and goddesses in explicit form, and of secret gatherings timed to coincide with the ancient ritual calendar. In some cases, these revivals were less about genuine religious devotion than about resistance to Roman authority, a defiant assertion that Egypt's identity could not be entirely reshaped by foreign hands. The persistence of these practices, even in diminished form, frustrated imperial governors who recognized that the line between religious tradition and political rebellion was perilously thin in a land where the sacred and the civic had always been intertwined. By the late Roman period, Egypt's once public celebrations of divine sexuality had been largely reduced to whispers, rumors, and the occasional scandalous discovery by an overzealous official. And yet, the memory of those customs lingered, preserved in fragments of papyri hidden in tombs, in the graffiti etched into the stones of remote shrines, and in the stubborn survival of certain symbols: the lotus, the entwined figures, the red-stained beer, whose meanings were known only to those who had inherited the stories from their elders. For the Romans, this was a victory of order over chaos, morality over decadence. For many Egyptians, it was the slow death of a living connection to their gods, a severing of the rituals that had once defined their place in the cosmos. In the end, the suppression did not so much erase the customs as drive them deeper underground, where they would continue to shape Egypt's cultural memory long after the empire that sought to extinguish them had crumbled into history. When Egypt's ancient temples finally fell silent, and the last of the priesthood faded into obscurity, it might have seemed that the most disturbing sexual customs of this civilization had been buried forever in the drifting sands. For over 1,000 years, they remained locked away in darkness, concealed beneath collapsed stone roofs and dunes that erased entire cityscapes. Yet their rediscovery in the 18th and 19th centuries did not bring the full truth into the light. Instead, a second and equally deliberate act of concealment began, not by Egyptian priests guarding sacred knowledge, but by European archaeologists, museum curators, and scholars who found themselves face to face with evidence so explicit, so at odds with their own moral codes, that they chose suppression over revelation. In the age of empire, when European powers viewed themselves as guardians of civilization, the idea that one of the world's most admired ancient cultures had intertwined its religion so deeply with sexual ritual was not a narrative they wished to present to the public. The glory of Egypt was to be marble statues, golden death masks, and orderly hieroglyphic inscriptions, not temple walls covered in intimate scenes or mummified remains bearing evidence of ritual modification. The earliest explorers, often amateur adventurers rather than trained archaeologists, set the tone for this selective history. Giovanni Belzoni, an Italian strongman turned tomb raider, uncovered chambers in the Valley of the Kings whose painted walls depicted explicit unions between deities and human figures, scenes that likely recorded the ceremonial acts described in ancient myth. Rather than document them, he ordered the images plastered over, writing in his journals that certain details were unfit for public consideration. Others followed his example. Auguste Mariette, founder of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, quietly moved artifacts with sexual imagery into restricted storage, labeling them under innocuous categories like miscellaneous pottery or decorative fragment so that they would not attract curiosity. By the time Egyptology began to professionalize, This culture of discretion had hardened into policy, with major institutions like the British Museum and the Louvre creating private cabinets, accessible only to select male scholars deemed trustworthy enough to handle such materials without being corrupted. The censorship was not limited to physical objects. Translation of ancient texts was similarly sanitized, with explicit passages either softened into vague euphemisms or omitted entirely. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the most important medical documents from ancient Egypt, contains dozens of sections on sexual health, fertility, and ritualized intimacy. Yet for more than a century after its discovery, large portions remained untranslated in published editions. Even when scholars knew the significance of these passages, they often chose to hide them behind academic jargon or misleading summaries. The reasoning was always the same. The public was not ready to know that Egypt's religious life had been infused with practices the modern West considered obscene. In doing so, they did not merely protect Victorian sensibilities, they rewrote the historical record, ensuring that generations of students and museum-goers would encounter an Egypt that was dignified, stately, and sanitized, stripped of the human complexities. Despite this institutional suppression, some fragments of the truth slipped through the net. Small references appeared in specialist journals, coded descriptions in excavation reports, and whispers among collectors about locked storerooms filled with artifacts too scandalous to display. Occasionally, chance discoveries broke into the open. In the 1920s, when Howard Carter's team examined the mummy of Tutankhamun with unprecedented care, they found that the boy king's body had undergone post-mortem alterations that defied conventional explanations. His genitals had been surgically removed, the wound sealed with resin, in a manner consistent with certain ritual prescriptions for preparing the dead for divine service. The finding was quietly noted, but never made central to the official narrative presented to the press or the public. In later decades, X-ray and CT scanning of other royal mummies revealed similar patterns, yet even in the 21st century, museums often framed these as mysteries, rather than acknowledging the direct connection to Egypt's long tradition of sexualized ritual. The cost of this long silence has been profound. By erasing or downplaying the sexual dimension of Egypt's religion and politics, historians have obscured the ways in which power can embed itself in the most intimate aspects of human life. The ancient Egyptians understood sexuality not merely as a personal matter, but as a source of cosmic energy that could be harnessed, controlled, and weaponized by those in authority. That understanding led to customs that, in our view, crossed every ethical boundary, from the public staging of ritual intercourse to the grooming of children for temple service, from the modification of bodies in life and death to the intoxicated chaos of festivals that erased all social limits. To confront these truths is not to diminish Egypt's achievements, but to see them in their full, often uncomfortable reality. A civilization that was brilliant and brutal in equal measure, that built wonders for the ages while binding its people in systems of control that reached into the core of their identity. Today, the legacy of these customs lingers in the margins of Egyptology, in the footnotes of academic papers, in the unopened crates of museum basements, and in the whispered conversations of guides who know the stories too dangerous to tell in front of tour groups. Modern scholarship, less bound by Victorian morality, has begun to re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes, piecing together the fragments to form a picture that is at once richer and darker than the one the 19th century allowed the world to see. Yet even now, the full extent of what happened along the Nile may never be known. Too much has been destroyed, too many artifacts lost or hidden, too many accounts filtered through the prejudices of those who believed that truth should be sacrificed to propriety. What remains is a shadow, compelling, unsettling, and incomplete. In the end, the most disturbing sexual customs of ancient Egypt are not just a historical curiosity or a salacious footnote to the grandeur of the pyramids. They are a reminder of how easily belief can be used to justify domination, how religion can sanctify exploitation, and how the human body itself can be turned into an instrument of political and cosmic control. For 3 millennia, these customs shaped the lives of kings and slaves alike, binding them in a system that promised divine order while demanding personal surrender. And for the centuries that followed, the decision to hide these truths has shaped our understanding of the past, teaching us that history is not only written by the victors, but also edited by those too afraid to confront what victory was built upon. To uncover these truths is to look directly into the face of power, ancient, enduring, and disturbingly familiar.